In World War II, the US had a factory that could build a B-24 bomber in 63 minutes. Hello, you fine folks. Today we're talking about massive construction projects of the Second World War. If that sounds boring, then let me hit you up with the largest artillery piece known to man, the largest single-story building in the world at the time, a massive underground hobbit hole fortress, and much, much more.
That is exciting.
World War II was a time of unparalleled industrial and military might, and the feats of production in those days are absolutely mind-bending. Whether it's building walls or producing machines that could take them down, those 1940s boys sure knew what they were doing.
What do I do with this?
So join me, and we'll cover 8 of the most ludicrous projects that were completed in or right before World War II. We're going to start off with either a very famous or very infamous creation of the French, the Maginot Line. The Maginot Line was an elaborate series of fortifications along France's border with Germany. Its purpose was to deter German aggression, conserve manpower for defense, and to slow or deflect a German advance so that France's military could mobilize in time. The Maginot Line was the brainchild of Marshal Joseph Joffre, though the idea of a static fortification was opposed by more forward-thinking French leaders who wanted to invest in mobile warfare technology. A statesman by the name of André Maginot was eventually able to convince the government to adopt this plan, and the Maginot Line became his namesake. Now I know that I pronounced Maginot somewhat correctly, and then in the same sentence I called the wall the Maginot Line, but I'm just going to do that for the rest of the video. I don't care. This is America, and I'm going to keep calling it what everybody else calls it. Just be happy I'm not saying Maginot. Construction of the Maginot Line began in 1929 and was completed in 1938. The finished product was a 280-mile-long series of defenses that were anywhere from 12 to 16 miles deep. That's right, it wasn't just one bunker thick, it was a several-mile-thick array of obstacles. It also technically extended another few hundred miles along Belgium, but the primary system was along the French-German border. This elaborate network consisted of formidable bunkers, pillboxes, gun emplacements, barricades, and outposts. It also had a number of sophisticated turrets that were built deep in the earth and could raise or retract as needed. It's estimated that more than half of France's 800,000 mainland troops were stationed along this network. To accommodate these troops, the Maginot Line had barracks, communication centers, supply depots, recreation areas, an underground rail network, and redundant telephone systems. It's estimated that this project required 1.5 million cubic meters of reinforced concrete and cost anywhere from $4 to $9 billion in today's money. To the French, it seemed impenetrable, and perhaps it might have been if they hadn't left the back door open at the Ardennes forest. The Germans exploited this weakness and swiftly flanked the line, proving the French entirely wrong that the forest was an adequate defense on its own. France surrendered in 6 weeks. If we travel a little north of the Maginot Line, we'll find our second entry, which was the largest fortress in the world at the time of its construction. Fort Eben-Emael, located in Belgium near the city of Maastricht. I'm so sorry for my pronunciations, I'm doing my best, I speak American. The foundations of this fortress were laid prior to World War I, but it was expanded and modernized from 1932 to 1935. The term fort doesn't quite do this thing justice, because its underground network spanned 185 acres, or 140 American football fields. If you had $1 for every square mile of this fortress, you'd have 29 cents. Almost enough to buy a grain of rice in 2024. Anyway, it was big. Eben-Emael was a hobbit-style fortress built into a hill, with 17 heavily fortified bunkers connected underground by miles of tunnels. The overall network was shaped like a triangle, and it wasn't meant to function so much as a physical wall, as much as a projection of danger, like a knight on a chessboard. This was due to the fact that it featured not only machine gun nests, 60mm anti-tank guns, and 75mm guns, but also 120mm artillery with a range of over 10 miles. These weapons allowed the fort to fiercely defend a wide range of important territory, requiring the Germans to deal with it if they wanted to invade Belgium. Eben-Emael was specifically situated to defend the River Meuse and the Albert Canal, giving the Germans a potentially miserable crossing. The fort featured both turrets and casemates for its guns, and was surrounded by a ditch for added protection. On the inside, this construction was permanently manned by 200 technical staff, and 2 rotations of 500 artillerists each would alternate manning its weaponry. The reinforced concrete structure kept the men comfortable by cycling fresh air from the surface. It even had a filtering system designed to mitigate a gas attack, making the fort nearly invulnerable. However, like the Maginot Line, Eben-Emael had a weakness. its roof was essentially defenseless. When Germany invaded Belgium on May 10, 1940, a force of specially trained commandos landed atop the structure in gliders. They used flamethrowers and explosives to knock out its main defenses, and used shape charges to tear it open for entry. After German ground troops arrived to reinforce the commandos, the defenders eventually surrendered. The impenetrable fort had fallen in a little over a day. If you think the French and the Belgians were ambitious, then you ain't ready for number 3, the Atlantic Wall. After the bulk of Allied forces were pulled out of Dunkirk in 1940, Germany had free reign of Western Europe. However, the Wehrmacht was unable to defeat the UK during the Battle of Britain, and it became evident that the Atlantic coastline could be vulnerable to a future Allied invasion. This was exacerbated by America's entry into the war, and in March of 1942, Hitler issued his Führer Directive No. 40, which dictated the construction of the Atlantic Wall. Work began soon after, and it continued right up until the D-Day invasion in 1944, not nearly being finished to the extent that the Germans had hoped. Nevertheless, this proved to be one of the most massive endeavors of World War II, covering 3,200 miles of coastline from Norway to Spain and the British Channel Islands in between. The project required a mind-numbing 22 million cubic yards of concrete and 1.2 million tons of steel. Nearly 10,000 permanent concrete structures were produced, including bunkers, artillery positions, walls, pillboxes, etc. The project cost over $200 billion in today's currency, almost enough to buy a whole month's worth of groceries for a family of 4. By the time of D-Day, Germany had positioned 60 divisions to defend this line, for a total force of something like 1 million men. The Atlantic coastline had 850 gun batteries, ranging from 37mm to 406mm artillery. It also had machine gun nests, minefields, airborne deterrents, and countless beach obstacles that are easily recognized in any cinematic depiction of D-Day. While a shortage of labor, resources, and transportation meant that the wall could not be fully completed, it was still a serious problem for the Allies. In the network of this defense were individually famous constructions, such as the 406mm Adolf guns, the observation tower at Alderney, and what happens to be our number 4, the Saint-Nazaire submarine base. The U-boat base at Saint-Nazaire is a structure that still stands today on the west coast of France. It was built over the course of 16 months from 1941 to 1942 and consists of almost 600,000 cubic yards of concrete. The harbor of Saint-Nazaire was already one of the largest in France, and when the Germans arrived, they determined it to be an ideal place for a specialized U-boat pen. The base was designed to be impervious to bombing raids, and its 26-foot thick roof consisted of layers of reinforced concrete, granite, and steel beams. True to its function, it had 14 submarine pens that could together host 20 U-boats at a time. 8 of the berths were dry dock for intense work, while the remaining 6 were for repairs and resupply. For defense, the base had machine guns, anti-aircraft cannons, and a menacing automatic 2-inch mortar. In addition, this 980-foot long, 430-foot wide, 59-foot tall structure had all the trappings of a small town. It had 62 workshops, 97 magazines, and 150 offices for its work, but also featured a hospital, housing, kitchens, 2 electrical plants, and even a restaurant. In total, it had a garrison of around 25,000 men. It also served as the home of the 6th and 7th U-boat flotillas, and it supported U-boats in over 400 patrols. Throughout the war, it was bombed a total of 13 times, receiving 44,000 pounds of bombs, but it never ceased operations until its surrender on May 8, 1945. Our final German contraption on the list is one that I've mentioned elsewhere on the channel, but I felt it still deserved a place here: the Schwerer Gustav railway gun. The Schwerer Gustav was the epitome of Hitler's obsession with only the most impressive, awe-inspiring, ludicrous pieces of super-modern technology. Whereas the strategy of the Allies was to produce effective weapons in overwhelming numbers, Germany's lack of industrial power meant it focused on smaller quantities of devastating machines, often to a fault. To this end, as France's Maginot Line came to fruition in the early 30s, Germany's answer was to order construction of the largest artillery piece in the history of mankind. That's right, the Schwerer Gustav was the heaviest single weapon ever produced and the largest caliber cannon ever to see combat. It weighed a ridiculous 1,350 metric tons and could fire an 800mm concrete-piercing projectile weighing 7 tons with a range of 29 miles. One of these shells is reported to have punched 100 feet into the earth. It could also fire lighter, high-explosive shells carrying 1,500 pounds of explosives, which could create a 30-foot crater upon impact. Its design was approved in 1937 with the stipulation that it be ready for the invasion of France in 1940, but this deadline wasn't quite met. Missing its opportunity to lay waste to the Maginot Line, the Gustav was first used in July of 1942 to begin pummeling Sevastopol. The completed gun was over 140 feet long and 23 feet wide, and it had a barrel length of 106 feet 8 inches. The Gustav was confined to railroad tracks for movement and required over 2,000 men to lay track for it to advance, and another 250 men to disassemble and reassemble it for longer journeys. Since it was so massive and thus a sitting duck to enemy aircraft, it was always accompanied by multiple flak battalions. As a side note, there is record of a second gun called Dora also being produced, but sources conflict on whether this was actually just the same gun or a different gun entirely. For our number 6, we turn north to England, where the Allies were hard at work scheming up ways to invade Normandy. In 1943, planners of the invasion were discussing the problem of harbors. The Allies had capability of landing an initial force directly on the beaches, but harbors would be necessary to support the foothold and allow the continuous unloading of troops and supplies. The port of Cherbourg wasn't far from the landing site, but it was uncertain how quickly the Allies would be able to capture it. Amidst this conversation, Commodore John Hughes Hallett joked, "Well, all I can say is, if we can't capture a port, we must take one with us." Laughter ensued, but the planners recognized that this was an actual possibility, and the project of the Mulberry Harbors was born. Granted, this idea had been floated around before, and Churchill had even issued a memo on the concept in 1942, but it wasn't until the Quebec Conference in 1943 that it was officially adopted. The idea was to assemble various elements of a portable harbor in England, and then tug them over for rapid installment on the coast of Normandy. It consisted not only of massive steel and concrete pontoons that would form the piers themselves, but also a system of caissons, derelict vessels, and breakwaters that served to shelter the inner harbor from the tossing sea. The massive caissons alone needed 500,000 cubic yards of concrete, 15 million feet of steel tubing, 30,000 tons of iron bars, and 50 miles of wire. In the end, not one, but 2 harbors were built. Mulberry A for the Americans at Omaha Beach, and Mulberry B for the British at Gold Beach. Assembly began as soon as the beaches were cleared, and the harbors were completed 12 days after D-Day. Each harbor was composed of 6 miles of flexible roadways, and they were each capable of offloading 7,000 tons of material every day. Unfortunately, the fiercest storm in 40 years whipped up the day after completion, and Mulberry A was utterly destroyed within a few days. Mulberry B was more naturally sheltered and was able to survive, and it was brought back up to full speed with salvaged components of the American harbor. Our number 7 is a true record breaker and was considered the largest single-story building at the time of its completion, the Willow Run bomber plant. Early on in the progression of the war, America had rolled up its sleeves and was setting about to use every square foot of manufacturing power it could access. The US was of course home to numerous industry tycoons, and the privatization of wartime manufacturing proved to be an invaluable asset. Bickering bureaucracy was largely kept out of production, and the independent giants of industry were able to do what they did best: build, build, build. Though technically retired, Henry Ford was one such tycoon that got involved in the war effort. He was a staunch isolationist before America's involvement in the war, but he eventually decided to help give his country the best fighting chance possible. One lucrative and all-important contract that became available was for the production of countless B-24 Liberator heavy bombers. Ford Motor Company jumped on the contract and constructed the Willow Run bomber plant in 1941 for this very purpose. The factory was a staggering 3.5 million square feet, and its assembly line was over 1 mile long. Using the same mass production technique of motor cars, Willow Run was able to produce a B-24 every 63 minutes. At its height, Willow Run had a workforce of over 42,000 employees, which necessitated the construction of local housing. Various developments were added around the factory, and they were able to house 15,000 people by the end of 1943. In addition, to help train new employees for factory work, Ford constructed the Aircraft Apprentice School, which could produce 8,000 qualified workers every week. By the end of the war, this unstoppable factory had produced 8,645 B-24s versus the 9,808 produced by 4 other factories combined. The subject of ridiculous American manufacturing brings us to our final entry on this list, the Kaiser Shipyards of the West Coast. Henry Kaiser was another industrialist whose methods achieved quicker shipbuilding at a fraction of the cost. He established the Kaiser Shipbuilding Company in 1939, which then built the 7 Kaiser shipyards in 1941 and 1942. 4 of these shipyards were constructed in Richmond, California, with the other 3 being built in the Northwest, 2 in Portland, Oregon, and 1 in Vancouver, Washington. The primary vessel produced was the Liberty ship, a cargo transport that measured in at 440 feet and displaced a bit over 14,000 tons. Before the Kaiser Shipyards, the industry standard to produce a Liberty ship was 230 days, but Kaiser was able to get this down to under 3 weeks. During a competition, one yard crew set a record by producing a Liberty ship in under 5 days. Kaiser was able to achieve this by implementing mass production techniques, including welding ships instead of riveting them, which allowed for use of less skilled laborers. Between the 7 shipyards, which occupied 1,700 acres of land, nearly 1,500 ships were produced during the war. Besides Liberty ships and the larger Victory ships, these yards also produced the ever-important LSTs, troop carriers, and even escort carriers. The Vancouver shipyard in particular produced all 50 of the Casablanca-class escort carriers of World War II. One of the greatest problems the Allies faced during the war was the German U-boat threat, but with the help of the Kaiser shipyards, America was literally producing cargo vessels faster than the Germans could sink them, and it was this asset that eventually allowed the Allies to invade Europe. And that concludes our foray into some of the most massive, ludicrous projects that came out of the World War II era. Comment below any entries you think should have made the list, and I may make a follow-up video. If you're looking for more wacky World War II content, try my video on the most bizarre planes of World War II, or just click over here for some random video of mine that YouTube thinks you'll like. If this video was worth your time, don't forget to like and do the subscribe so you stay tuned in for all future vids. I'll see you guys in the next video. Ruibas out.